Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Maureen Knighton with the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation and a member of the GIA board. In his most recent book, Jeff Chang asserts that to believe in the arts is close to having religious faith. That statement gives you some sense of his grounding and indicates why he's a fitting keynote speaker for today's program here at GIA. But if you want to know a bit more about who he is, take a look at his Twitter handle. That handle, Zentronics, provides clues to the cultures that shaped him and in which he remains deeply rooted. Let me break it down for you. Zen, signaling his Chinese ancestry, and also a nod to his DJ moniker, DJ Zen. And Tronics, instantly recognizable to those in the know as a signifier of hip-hop culture. Now, Jeff, I did try to check in with you about this, but if that's not right, my apologies, it's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Now, a Twitter handle is hardly the source one would turn to provide someone insights into someone as extraordinary as Jeff Chang. I was aware of Jeff as a journalist before the two of us ever met. And I must admit that after years of seeing his byline in numerous major national publications, I was a bit starstruck when we met. I tried to play it off, though. Later, when we were each invited to attend a meeting on his home island of Oahu, we had a chance to chat a bit. As it turned out, we knew people in common, and we also shared a keen interest in culture change. Over the course of that meeting, I learned about his deep love for and dedication to his family, to his land, his commitment to community, and his insistent and relentless quest for justice. And my admiration for him grew. Now, by the time he taught me my first Hawaiian words, ma'aka, mokai, ewa, and diamond head, describing directional bearings on the island, I was a fan forever. The generosity and powerful intellect that were so evident in our early interactions are immediately apparent in his work. Hopefully you've had a chance to read the bio that's supplied in the program book, but as you might imagine, that's only the tip of the iceberg. Jeff has seemingly packed multiple lifetimes of achievement into his still young life. He co-founded Culture Strike and the online magazine Color Lines, was an organizer of the inaugural National Hip Hop Political Convention, interviewed President Barack Obama, and won numerous awards and accolades along the way. Jeff's most recent book, We Gon' Be All Right, Notes on Race and Resegregation, was published to great acclaim. And he currently serves as executive director of Stanford University's Institute for Diversity in the Arts. An incisive cultural critic and political commentator, Jeff is a leader built for the 21st century, for this moment. A multi-hyphenate, super achiever journalist, author, lecturer, music critic, DJ, organizer, educator, and former music industry executive. More than a decade ago, poet, writer, and performer Sekou Sundiata wrote, "At the advent of new realities, artists have always been called to respond to the shifting grounds of their lives and times, to give weight and meaning to those times. Think the surrealists in World War I, the bebop musicians in World War II, the beat poets in the Cold War era, and so on. This is such a time. And this idea and the spirit and wisdom it contains live on in the writing, values, voice, and vision of Jeff Chang. Please join me in giving him a warm GIA welcome.
I don't know who that person is. He just, oh my God. But I guess I have to live up to that now. Thank you. Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Thank you so much, Maureen, and thank you so much, Janet, and Jim, and Eddie. It's a profound honor to be here at this particular moment in GIA's history, to be able to honor Janet, Jim, and the staff's incredible work, and to be able to see Eddie coming in. GIA has been a home to me. It's been an environment an environment of trust for me, support. In 2007, I was able to actually come to GIA, and we had an amazing session where I got to test out the ideas that became Who We Be, my second book. And in 2011, my homie Fabiana Rodriguez and I were able to come and speak about this project that we had just helped to co-found, Culture Strike. And so GIA has meant a lot to me as somebody who is, a practitioner, as somebody who's been thinking, as somebody who follows and has been supported by so many of you here in the room. It's been a beacon for all of us, and I'm just really happy to be able to be here. And I know that I'm returning during a time of great urgency for us. Janet and Jim, in our early call, noted that this is the first gathering since the election. And last year, of course, I wrote and published a book at about the same time. It was written before the election. It was published before the election. And so, as Maureen noted, this is the title. And so the book began with Donald Trump. And it's okay to laugh. We need that every once in a while these days, right? The book began with Donald Trump, and I thought, this is a really bad way to start a book. He'll never get elected, and then the book will be kind of dead in the water and whatever, but here we are. And the book it began with Donald Trump, and it ended with Beyonce, because after Beyonce, there's really nothing left to say. Right? And the book is about the way that we as a nation have resegregated ourselves. Over the past half century, we've allowed to be dismantled, the structures that were put in place to try to move us towards racial justice and cultural equity. Sometimes quietly and sometimes very loudly, this has happened. And so the structures have been dismantled, and that's part of why we're gathered here, to try to figure out how to build those back up. And it's brought us into this very fraught historical moment. And so I have to admit that it's been really difficult to be out there with a book like this, with this kind of a title. And every week, of course, seems to present new evidence that we might not be all right. But if you think about the song that I took the title from, right? Kendrick Lamar's All Right. It's a song in which most of the lyrics are about struggle, about his personal struggle as a young black man in South Los Angeles, right? And then he gets up to the chorus, and his knees are getting weak. He's at the preacher's door, and seemingly out of nowhere, he pulls this idea that we're going to be all right. And so it's about the struggle. It's about the daily struggle, but then against all odds, it's also about the leap of imagination, that leap of faith. Right? It's a reminder that our imagination can outlast the passing darkness and take us to a brighter day. And I know we need that right now, in this particular moment. A Washington Post poll this past weekend showed that 7 in 10 Americans believe we've reached a quote-unquote dangerous low point. And the same number believe that we are as divided as we were at the height of the Vietnam War. And almost 6 in 10 believe that, quote, there are fewer things that bind Americans together today than in the past. So we're a polarized nation that feels as if it's heading towards more division. And what's been driving this over the past decade have been the culture wars, and these culture wars have exacted a body count. And at one point last spring, of course, we wondered whether the NEA and the NEH were going to end, And while it turns out that they didn't, we still worry about a national backlash against the arts and the humanities. And deeper still, we feel that the values that they advance, that the arts and culture advances towards joy and beauty and inclusion and seeing each other in our wholeness and building stronger community, we feel that those values are not those of our leaders. And the truth is that each generation we've been drawn back into crisis. It's always a crisis over racial injustice, which remains this nation's original sin, the thing that grows in the absence of our attention, that will always return in chaos and fire and pain. And so this is what it was when I was coming of age, 25 years ago in 1992. And so it was a generation before me in 1965, the year of Selma, the year of the peak of the Civil Rights Movement, right? The year of the Voting Rights Act. And not incidentally, also the year that the National Endowment for the Arts was founded. The year of the last national consensus for racial justice and cultural equity. It's been over 50 years since we've had a national consensus for racial justice and cultural equity. And so we find ourselves in this cycle of crisis from 1965 to 1992 to right now. We're caught in this cycle of crisis. There's a crisis, there's a reaction, there's a backlash. We're living through the backlash right now. And then there's a sense of exhaustion, a sense of what can we really do about this anyway? And then we fall back into crisis. And I know it's not lost on all of you here who've been so deeply committed to working on these issues, that our national attention to these issues seems to feel episodic, right? It follows these cycles, and it leads us back into new cycles of crisis. Diversity is a fact. It's a fact, like climate change. It's going to happen regardless of whether we decide to pay it attention or not, right? But inequity is also a fact, and it's grown because of the lack of our attention. And so we're seeing what happens when diversity is blooming and inequity is intensifying at exactly the same time. We've fallen back from the commitments that we've made over the last 25 years, and 25 years from today, we'll have no one to blame but ourselves. And so I tell my students that the most important question of their lifetimes, up there with how we address climate change, right, is if we all are minorities, how do we begin to imagine a new majority? And so this leads us into the ideas of the late, great, deeply missed Detroit revolutionary Grace Lee Boggs. And I want to talk about Grace's idea of revolution. Grace argued that we tend to think of revolution as something that's won in bloodshed, right? In which one group in power is replaced with another group in power. But as Grace has put it, the next revolution might be better thought of as, quote, advancing humankind to a new stage of consciousness, creativity, and political responsibility. Her revolution will require us to move away from finding new ways to divide and rule, to consign some to death, and instead to pivot to life for all of us, to honor and transform ourselves in our relations to each other. Grace insists that we rethink how we see each other, how we choose to be and choose to be together. And so she urges us to move beyond empathy into mutuality, to move beyond relationships that are about exploitation and extraction towards relationships that are about exchange and support and generosity and trust. That we start from truly seeing each other and move towards acting for each other. That we move past resistance into transformation. And so we're all here today because we believe in this revolution. We believe in art. And we believe in art because we believe in life, in all its variations, in all its beauty. We also believe that the ugliness, the violence of inhumanity can and must be transformed. We believe that art and culture changes things, that culture change is the engine for social change. And if we can't imagine it and don't believe it, it can't happen. But on the other hand, if it can happen, it's because we imagined it and we believed it. And the active word here, of course, is we. These are ideas that we advance together, usually and most powerfully from the bottom up, with the leadership, not merely the consent, of those to whom has been done the most harm. And that's the basis of movements for equity and for justice. That's where revolutions come from. And so the arts have brought about revolutions of being. The great artistic movements have risen up to say, we are here. We have always been here. The only urgency is for you to open your eyes now and see. And so too these revolutions demanded seeing, that we see each other in our full humanity and recognize each other in our full humanity. These are revolutions of consciousness. They require that we not apologize for our right to be, and that the demand to be seen be heeded by all. So the cultural revolution of this past century worked hand in hand with social movements, manifested itself in institutions as different as Tennessee's Highlander Center, founded in 1932, right? Chicago's Afro-Cobra, founded in 1972. San Francisco's Kearny Street Workshop, founded the same year. Or New York City's High Arts, founded in 2000. These helped to foster the very notion of cultural democracy. And in the first 13 years of the NEA, large commitments were made to funding the arts, peaking at the equivalent in 2015 dollars of $500 million in funding. And after communities of color mobilized to press the NEA to fund them, and the NEA responded with new programs to meet those demands, what we saw was the creation of local arts ecosystems. And these local ecosystems formed a national ecosystem. These organizations fostered fervent creativity in the arts, in their areas. They developed artists and works. They incubated big ideas like cultural democracy and cultural equity. They made possible the critical and commercial breakthrough of artists of color, women artists, and queer artists, and transgender artists in the 1980s and the 1990s. And so let us note that the outbreak of the culture wars during the 1980s and the 1990s that eventually resulted in the massive defunding of the NEA was a backlash against these same communities, right? These same communities who are shaking off invisibility and changing the narrative of the nation. The opponents of the NEA didn't see their work as defunding as much as defanging, right? Animus against minority communities is the main engine of the culture wars then and now. The attack on arts and culture wasn't an effect of white supremacy. White supremacy was the cause of the attack on arts and culture. And it still is, just ask the Houston Texans, right? And yet we practice a kind of faith, right? We do this because we believe. We believe that art and culture may become a remedy to the times that we're in. It can allow us to see again, to close the gaps again. In its mimicry of life, great art helps us to close the difference between the self and the other. And another way to say this is that through art, we learn once again how to experience empathy. But although empathy is the first necessary step, it's not enough. Empathy is nothing without action. Action is what moves empathy towards equity. Equity means making the values, the pleasures, the ways of knowing and being that the arts and culture enable to be valued by all. It means fair representation, inclusion, and access. And fundamentally, it means shared power. It comes down to forming relations between ourselves and others that are not based in domination, but in exchange and trust. So empathy creates the possibility of equity, and it also creates the possibility of community, and equity cannot be attained separate from community. And so equity is our current horizon of imagination, right? And I also say to you today, knowing full well that if we begin to succeed, equity will be a word that will be reappropriated by those who wish to maintain the status quo, just as the words equality and opportunity and diversity have been reappropriated. But for now, equity remains the horizon of our imagination because we're so far from it. Inequality in arts funding is even more severe than U.S. income inequality. In the U.S., the top 20% receives 51% of the nation's income. But in arts funding, and shout out here to Holly Sidford and Alexis Frass and the Helicon Collaborative, in arts funding, the top 2% receives 58% of the total gifts, grants, and contributions. And rural, low-income, and people of color people are the most impacted. Now, some have pointed out rightly that the structure of nonprofits art funding reflects legacy giving, that the biggest arts institutions in the U.S. are often amongst the oldest. Many date to a period when the Western European descended cultural forms were ascended. But I think this argument is strangely ahistorical. Capital has supported and still supports a structure that upholds a narrow monocultural definition of what this nation is meant to be. We can't forget that the nonprofit arts sector was born from the wealth of industrialization and centered on the cities and the suburbs as a gift to those who were perceived to be part of the white bourgeoisie. And this was a time, of course, when Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans and Irish were not white. And we can't forget that American popular culture was built on the narratives of American Indian subjugation, right? The Wild West show, and black dehumanization, blackface minstrelsy, and the spectacle of the other in the circus. And a century later, multiculturalism, which openly challenged Eurocentrism, was most often supported by government, rarely by the philanthropic sector, and only belatedly and begrudgingly by the culture industry. Inequity is how the system is wired. And so cultural inequity continues to appear in our age as cultural segregation. And in fact, since we've gone backwards on many of these questions over the past 25 years, we can rightly call it resegregation. And I don't think I need to mention that intensifying resegregation in the face of increasing diversity is a terrible, terrible thing. And so here's the problem we're trying to solve. Once again, increasing inequity in a time of increasing diversity. And it's not hard to imagine what it means if we fail to address this now. Working towards cultural equity means working towards a transformation of representation, access, and power. And we've spent a lot of time tracking and thinking about representation. Data is very important. And these past several years, GIA has led the way in getting data where for years there was just nothing. And now we know the extent of the problem. We need to continue to do this on a regular basis, not merely be episodic about how we're monitoring the problem. But we don't talk as much about access. Who has access to funded resources? Who does not? For those who are locked out, what are their barriers to access? What are the assets they hold and are developing? What might they gain were they given access to other asset holders, whether individuals or organizations or institutions? Opening up access leads to more openings for truly transformative leadership. And truly transformative leadership gets to the heart of the question, power sharing and transfer of power. If we are building for diversity, we will inevitably reproduce a tokenistic system that rarely succeeds. Building for equity is something else entirely. And so what I'm saying is we should not be building a different hued 2%, right, with the same culture of exclusion that got us here. We should be focused on building 100% with a culture of equity. And that's how we move from sharing power and transferring power to transforming power. And so let us focus on building ecosystems, not pipelines. Pipelines are built to fast-track diversity. But here again is where the difference between diversity and equity rears itself. Pipelines rarely challenge the culture of exclusion that undergird the systems that they're in. Ecosystems can create cultural shifts. And here we can seek some guidance from some other great Detroit thinkers, Adrienne Marie Brown and our dear friend Il Weaver. And look at their application of the ecological idea of emergence. They define emergence as the way complex systems, complex movements, build from small, simple interactions. And the metaphors are biological, the way that ants build colonies with local information through an elaborate system of roles. The way that flocks of birds move through the sky because of the way that smaller groups of 7 birds sense each other's shift in direction. The way that single dandelions disperse seeds to prolifically become a field of dandelions. Too often we focus on creating pathways to leadership that are linear, believing that if we just line up the dominoes from entry to leadership, they'll fall, right? And we'll somehow diversify leadership and have the kind of system that is equitable. But all too often, we reproduce the same notions of value that made the system exclusive in the first place. So what might less hierarchical ecosystems produce instead? During the 2000s, I was part of the Ford Foundation's Future Aesthetics cohort, an experiment in cultural equity that touched literally hundreds of performing artists and writer-critics such as myself to advance aesthetics that were keeping faith with a younger, more diverse generation. Future aesthetics was an ecosystem. In fact, it gave us the language to talk about the ecology of arts and funding and equity. And we built stronger, deeper connections, more intentional, evolving relationships. We came to recognize our interdependence. We formed these relationships based in trust, in mutuality, in struggle, in complexity, generosity, and love. And now we can point to how the global youth poetry slam movement and hip-hop theater have moved to scale because of the work that we produce together. Without us, there would be no Hamilton. And if you think about one of the opening battles of the Trump-era culture wars, right? The debate between the administration and the cast of Hamilton, right? About the role of the arts and theater in culture, what art is supposed to do in society. We can see how important building this ecosystem was. And that's what we've been experimenting with at Stanford at the Institute for Diversity in the Arts. We focus on how young artists can build relationships to each other. They decide on their values and goals. We teach them the skills to build arts communities, and then they do so, forming interlocking circles of creativity that power the campus arts community and that are linked, in turn, to the surrounding communities of color. That's to say that we don't merely teach them how to put together a portfolio or how to apply for a grant or get a job in the arts world. We help them to imagine their own arts world, to build their own ecologies of creativity, and their peers inevitably come to recognize them as leaders. The values they advance shape a more equitable and open arts community, something much bigger than the sum of its parts. What we know from history is that funding the growth of arts ecosystems in under-resourced communities has powerful impacts, powerful halo effects. And as these local ecosystems find their growing edge, I love that term, growing edge. One of my students came up with it. Not cutting edge, but growing edge, right? They build new relationships. They scale larger. Sometimes they become movements that advance transformative ideas and aesthetics, and these movements can literally change the way that we see each other, learn to be together. If they can do that, then why couldn't they also change the very way that the arts and culture are structured? Here's a picture of the B-girl Rockefeller. Her company with her partner, the B-boy Quickstep, is called Full Circle. It was one of the first hip-hop theater companies. So we can think about equity as beginning in a circle. The circle is a powerful metaphor for community. In the circle, all points are equal distant from the center. In the circle, we can all see each other. The circle is also the space of creation. It's the cipher, right? It's where tradition returns, where innovation happens, where the relationship between the individual and the crowd is restored. It's where the community affirms itself and tests itself and emerges transformed. To 5%ers, 0 is the cipher, and it marks the completion of the cycle, the highest level of attainment. So 0, the circle, revolution. We have no choice but to make our revolution. The stakes are way too high. But we can also remember, as Janet was saying, that we're creating a revolution that's about coming together, finding joy, evoking wonder, dreaming of possibility. It's fun, right? It's ecstatic. And so here's Ana Teresa Fernandez on the border dividing Tijuana from San Diego. And she reminds us that our revolution is based in love and life. It can build spaces of dignity, of justice, and freedom. It can provide new openings to new meanings, new possibilities, new futures. It can become infectious, unstoppable, irresistible. So let's use all of our genius, all of our creativity, all of our glory to make it so. Thank you very much for listening today. Thank you so much to Janet and all of you.